Hello, Telesur English presents a new episode of China Now, a Wave Media's production that showcases the culture, technology and politics of the Asian giants. In this first segment, the Thinkers Forum welcomes Michael Brenner, Professor of International Affairs at the University of Pittsburgh, to discuss about the meaning of political system based upon the principle of popular sovereignty.
Let's go back a bit in history. The United States was born in what I believe was a state of original virtue. And the United States, and the founders of the United States in the late 18th century, believed that they were creating something entirely new, unique in the world. And in some sense, it was. A political system based upon the principle of popular sovereignty, multi-democratic representative institutions, and so forth. That was unique in the world at the time. And so the United Americans have always been very self-conscious about what they believe to be their exceptionalism and, in some sense, the superiority in terms of political virtue. And there's always been a great underlying, or two versions of how this might express itself in regard to the rest of the world, either as an example, as a model of what could be accomplished, or as an agent, or actually as a combination of the two. You know, the former notion is associated with first presented by George Washington in his farewell address, and he spoke explicitly: the United States should avoid the great power games, the entangling alliances of the old world, wanted to separate itself from that and believed that it could. At the same time, over the course of the 19th century, the United States did pursue an expansionist policy in North America. It started the war with Mexico in 1848, which was a war of conquest. Started the war on a flimsy pretext against Spain in 1898, and so on. But the country as a whole did not see itself as having global ambitions until World War I came. And of course, after World War I, there was well-known version from a global role leadership of the United States had by that time become the dominant financial power and played a significant role with reparations and all of that after the war. The great sea change came with World War II. And after World War II, with the post-war era, the United States as a whole, leaders and populists accepted like it was a world power. But it thought of itself as a world power with good intentions that would create what the social scientists call public goods. And that is conditions that would serve everybody's interest, not just the self-interest of the United States. And of course, the two, in American minds, merged. So therefore, what was an American self-interest was also the world's interest. And so the United States became a global power with it, at that time, and the Cold War, etc. After the Cold War, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, in a way, the question, reopened itself. What would the United States position on the world? There were very few voices saying that we should retreat again or greatly diminish our world presence. Instead, what you got was a dedication to a far-reaching program to promote liberal values, political and economic, across the expanse of the former Soviet Union and around the world. And this conformed very nicely to American philosophy, American ideals, and so forth. There was also a hard-nosed realpolitik aspect to it. And there were, if you want to see a seminal document of this realpolitik version of an American commitment to reshaping the world in its own image, you look at the famous memorandum called Paul Wolfowitz. Paul Wolfowitz, you recognize that name? He was a figure in the Defense Department. He was a leader of the group of the school of thought we now call the neoconservatives or neocons. He wrote a memorandum in February of 1991, in which he laid out in detail and outlined a comprehensive program for what today we would call American hegemony. And he said this was a unique historical opportunity to achieve one, complete security for the United States, two, the predominance almost globally of American and Western values in Western style institutions, political and economic, and so forth. And as part of this, the United States has to be actively engaged in every region of the world. And the Wolfowitz doctrine, if you want to call it that, argued in very traditional power political terms, not in traditional American idealist terms. You had this merger, this convergence of both the idealistic strain. The United States was going to lighten the path, shed light on the path of enlightenment and democratic institutions and prosperity and international cooperation. And the West would be the custodians of the United States, of this, and the United States would be the lead agent. That was the idealistic version. The Wolfowitz version, and the followers, who have since prevailed, was the United States simply has to use its predominant power to create this world. And that meant, one, preventing any rival from arising that could challenge the United States. And this might entail diplomatic, political, economic action, and also coercive military action. And that's where the idea came of not just preemptive war, but preventive war. And that is to use coercive means, whether they be military or otherwise, depending on the circumstances and the region and so forth, to prevent the emergence of any hostile nation or grouping of nations who could oppose and resist and thwart this grand American strategy. One expression of this was in NATO enlargement. And NATO enlargement from the very beginning was predicated on the notion that Russia was a separate entity and should not be included, or should not be included in what would become pan-European institutions, which is Gorbachev and subsequent Russian leaders, actually down to Mr. Putin, and always urged and expected. But instead, you get this NATO alliance, and these other European countries were absorbed into NATO and its accompanying economic and political collective institutions. And Russia was to be kept marginalized and weak. At best, it would be like a country cousin, which is an American phrase, I guess. A second-class citizen in the Europe of the future, and economically, of course, everybody desired its vast natural resources. Over time, this was 1991. At the time that it was leaked, it was thought to be embarrassing. I was in Paris at the time giving a talk at the French military, and President then George W.H. Bush, the elder Bush, publicly said, no, this is not American policy, and so on. What's happened over the ensuing 30-odd years is that the Wolfowitz view of the world and conception of American global interest and American strategy has prevailed and is now pervasive. And almost all of the American foreign policy community bases their thinking on premises that were built into and underlay and were the foundation of the Wolfowitz doctrine, which means that the United States, in the thinking, American sort of, geostrategic policymakers and Pentagon as well, because the Pentagon actually developed their own version of this, which was to have escalation dominance in every region of the world, including Central Asia. Even Hillary Clinton at one point talked about making Afghanistan an American leaning, adopted stumbling block to the Belt and Road Initiative. And the United States at that time, in the 2000s, was very active, trying to win over Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan, and the Stan is absolutely absurd, of course. That gives an indication of how expansive were these ambitions and the conception of what would represent American hegemony, which is increasingly divorced from reality, increasingly improbable of success, which has produced failure after failure, but which now still maintains its hold on the thinking of the U.S. government. I'm going to simplify things somewhat. So the big question is, what are the implications, and how do you get out of this trap? Go back to the failures. The United States, in terms of interventions in the Middle East, it failed in Iraq and caused incredible havoc in the region. Iraq just wants the United States to get off its territory now. It failed in Syria. It failed ignominiously in Afghanistan. And of course, those failures in the Middle East are now becoming much deeper and deeper because of this quite illogical willingness to act as an accomplice to Israel, which has lost it, as you know. I mean, much of its standing in the world, certainly its moral standing, etc., outside of the West, as rather narrowly defined. And of course, its greatest failure, which it doesn't recognize, was to provide very powerful incentives for Russia and China to become very deep partners. I mean, after all, the opening to China in 1972 was meant to deepen divisions between the Soviet Union and China. And to some extent, it worked. That was a very complicated triangle. In a less dramatic way, it would certainly be in the United States' interest in any conventional, traditional, strategic thinking, at least not to encourage Russia and China to become close partners. Until very recently, the United States did entertain the idea that it could keep them separate, even after it became evident that their interests were converging. Their primary common interest being to prevent American domination, well, obviously. So they even under President Biden, before the Ukraine war, not Biden himself, Secretary Blinken, went to Moscow and in effect said to the Russians, look, you guys should really be afraid of the Chinese. Look how strong they are, their vast economy. You have all these empty lands in Siberia and so forth. And don't forget the Mongols and all that and so forth. You'd be very careful. Why don't you simply hang around with us? Of course, you'd be in a subordinate position. We'd offered them nothing in the way of serious incentives, the Russians. And of course, the Russian response was, "You're crazy, go to hell." in polite language. But the fact that the American leaders retained in these fantasies right up to a few years ago is hard evidence of how divorced American strategic thinking has become, divorced from reality. And then, its messages to, your government in China have been equally unrealistic, and this hasn't been really very, very professional. I mean, this constant, the constant refrain that you state publicly, the United States recognizes the one China principle, or the United States does everything it can to secure Taiwan's autonomy and independence. I mean, this is childish. It's not just ineffectual. I mean, you'd have to believe that the Chinese leadership are absolute what? I mean, low IQ, idiots to not see the contradiction. So as the United States has become locked into this deeply flawed and impossible strategy of subduing its rivals in Russia and China as absolutely necessary to maintain and extend American global dominance, it's accompanied by a very unprofessional diplomacy. The United States, as Ambassador Freeman, Chas Freeman, has said many times frequently, he says the United States does not conduct diplomacy anymore. It issues, it takes unilateral action. Well, it issues demands, gives instructions, and so forth. Now, that's the situation we're in. Now, I have a few ideas of my own.
We have a short break now, but we'll be right back. Stay with us. Welcome back to China Now. Thinkers Forum welcomes also Yi Man, Professor of Economics at Shanghai Jiao Tong University, and David Hertz, co-founder and editor-in-chief of Middle East Eye, to discuss the challenges of the present world. Let's see.
Donald Trump's policy, this so-called forbidden to sell computer chips to China, is a very destructive way to compete and will eventually help China and destroy the US. The reason I give to them is the following. I said if you look at the US own industrialization policy and look at the history of the rise of Europe, look at the UK and Germany, for example, and Japan, and look at China, as I said earlier, every successful nation has relied on, in one way or another, industrial policy. China has gone all the way from rural industry, also called township village enterprises, all the way to high-speed rails and all the way to sort of frontier. But China still has the last mile to travel in terms of before becoming the leader of technology innovation. And this last mile to travel actually is the high precision equipment and computer chips. And if China would want to use the traditional approach, which was used by the US in the 19th century, used by UK, its history, and Japan, China should do the following: to violate every possible WTO agreement, to set up high tariff walls against importing US or foreign computer chips, so as to protect China's domestic computer chip market and incentive Chinese firms to engage in chip production, even though this is going to take a long time for China to catch up, and this is going to utilize China's huge domestic market to facilitate the competition among Chinese firms to upgrade their chip technology. But this is very expensive, and the government also need to burn a lot of money to facilitate this process. But however, because of the WTO agreement, Chinese government dare not to do that. And if China start to do that, I think every nation as a member of WTO will sue against China and will kick China out of WTO because this is an obvious violation of WTO agreement. So China could not do that. But if China does not do that, China will never be able to develop its own chip industry and will always rely on foreign imported computer chips. But turns out that has been the case, and the U.S. is the largest beneficiary of this kind of global trade. U.S. design computer chips, and some other economies produce it, and China purchase it. And China is the largest market to absorb this kind of chip industry output. So I think that situation ideally should be long-lasting, but it turns out President Donald Trump decided to destroy that. Donald Trump says that, hey, I want to help you, China. I'm not going to sell you any computer chips. And from now on, you have to rely on your own to innovate, to invent, to produce, to design your own computer chips. So I told my American colleagues, actually, that's a good news for China. China wanted to do that by set up high tariffs to protect the chip industry and spending 10, 20, 30 years to develop that. But China could not do that. And China also lacks the national will to do that. If the government say, we want to do this, all the private sector will revolt against the government. But Donald Trump is actually creating a magical policy to help China. Say, I don't want to sell you computer chips. Now you're on your own. This gives China the greatest possible opportunity and strong willpower to develop its own computer chips. And even though in the short run, it's going to be very painful for China, but in the long run, China will be the biggest winner, and the US will be the biggest loser in this regard. So I think this is fundamentally the largest possible strategic mistake made by the US government. And the Biden administration unfortunately inherited this Donald Trump policy and keep doing this kind of policy. There's a view that Chinese economy has already peaked. I think that view is completely inconsistent with the history of industrialization. As I mentioned earlier, China is still in the process of finishing its industrial revolution or industrialization. If we further divide the process of industrialization into several stages, we can call the first stage, the textile light industrial revolution, and the railroad or steel-led heavy industrial revolution, and then the so-called IT technology-led third industrial revolution, today AI and new energy-led fourth industrial revolution. But based on my research of economic history, any nation, if we want to become modernized, you cannot just directly jump into fourth industrial revolution. You still have to repeat the earlier waves of industrial revolution to be successful, because every earlier wave of industrial revolution create the market condition for the second or the next industrial revolution to take place, because that requires a market condition for all type of new technology to be profitable. Now China's entering the race of fourth industrial revolution on a par with the US. So even though China now is already entering this race of fourth industrial revolution, but China has not completely finished its earlier phases. For example, China still has a large agricultural sector which is not completely modernized, and leaving China with still about 30%, around 30% or even more population living in the rural area. So China still has a huge room to develop and to finish its industrialization process. And today, China's average per capita income is still at the average level of the globe, and it's not high income economy yet. But what gives me the confidence that China is able to fill that gap and completely finish the earlier phase of industrial revolution was based on the three observations. Number one, China has followed the right industrial sequence or industrial policy. The second most important aspect is state capacity. And China clearly still keeps that state capacity, and that's a very important critical element. And many developing countries now, we see they are not able to develop, and they fall into the so-called poverty trap or middle income trap is precisely the lack of state capacity, which is not the case in China. And the third most important element, which I view very importantly to support my argument to be optimistic about China, is that technology development mostly comes from learning by doing, not from universities, not from schools. Therefore, in a sense, the most important university is not on school campus, but is in the manufacturing sector. And China has the world's largest manufacturing sector ever in human history that created the largest learning opportunity and the opportunity for creation, for innovation in China. China's university, of course, still look backward compared to US universities. But if you look at US history, fundamental science was never an important issue for the government in the 19th century. In the 19th century US, US government never paid attention to fundamental research. They just applied the research, scientific research from Europe to their economy. They try to become the -- manufacturing center. And it is only after US become manufacturing center, their innovative capacity start to explode. Earlier, they were just simply a follower or mimicking European technology. But once they moved into the frontier of manufacturing, and the US was forced to become the leader, and the opportunity for innovation also become widely open. That's also the case in China. And that's the foundation for China to become one of the most innovative nation in science, even in basic science in the future. Lots of people say that China become the factory of the world, become the center of global manufacturing was because of WTO. I think that view is biased because China became the #1 nation in terms of capacity and market for textiles by 1995. In other words, in 1995, 6 years before China joining WTO, China was already the world #1 textile producer and exporter. Therefore, 6 years later, when China joined WTO, China was ready to exploit or utilize the global market. Whereas other developing countries such as India, they joined WTO earlier than China did, but there was very little effect. This most important reason was because those nations were not ready at all. Their government did not, or they failed to nurture the correct industry using correct industrial policy. But China started to nurture textile industry, started in economic reform by 1979. And so with almost 15 years of continuous government nurturing and facilitation and assistance, China's textile industry developed very rapidly. Earlier was led by SOEs, by state-owned textile factory. Later on, led by private enterprises. But even private enterprises also need government help for them to grow rapidly and in a healthy manner. So therefore, the very reason WTO served as an important juncture for China to become the center of manufacturing was not because of WTO per se, was rather because of China's government industrial policy to facilitate and to develop textile industry before that. Now China's industrial revolution is featuring automobiles and China's EV cars and China's solar panel, new energy in technology now is the leader of the world. The Chinese government started to nurture, facilitate a new energy technology back 10 or even 20 years ago. And so there has been a long history and preparation for China to develop and to innovate in this industry. Chinese government has provided lots of financial support to build lots of infrastructure which is required for EV cars to function smoothly and to be commercializable and to be accessible and user-friendly by household. And without those industrial policy, for example, China's capacity to generate electricity is very important. Nowadays, if you travel to some other emerging economies such as Vietnam and India, you realize one thing which is very striking, that is the lack of the capacity to supply enough electricity. China electricity capacity or supply capacity now is number one in the world. It's producing twice as much electricity than the US. And that provided the foundation for the EV industry to emerge.
The American attitude to China has waxed and waned. It was very hostile, and then there was Nixon in China. Under Kissinger was a great pragmatist about China. And now what we've got is a very, very old-fashioned order where you have basically China and America confronting each other. And I think primarily that is a result of the imperial decline of America. You know, all empires crumble. They crumble quite quickly as well. But they also find it quite difficult to work out what's happening as they're crumbling. China's a rising power, and it is waiting quite patiently for that Western influence to die down. What should be happening is a fundamental reassessment by the West of all world relations, and we should be building up, not destroying the UN. And there should be a specific dialogue between America and China. But the forces are pushing China and America away from each other are massive. And that really is a great sadness, because we're in a historic transition. But I really do think the West is at a real inflection point at the moment, and that affects everything that happens around it. In a sense, powers like China, Iran, Russia are moving into a vacuum created by the retreat of the West. And so that's all that's happening in that sense. It's not overtly projecting its power, but it is moving into a vacuum. Yes, I think China is playing a very important role in the Middle East, and an increasing one. I don't think it is directly involved yet in actual negotiations, but it's becoming a platform for agreement, which is also quite interesting. China has become a platform for two quite interesting agreements. One was a reconciliation between Saudi Arabia and Iran, which was suddenly announced in Beijing by the Chinese between Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia invited China to be the host of a reconciliation agreement with Iran, which is very, very important for the stability of the region. I'm not saying China was involved in the reconciliation itself, but it became a platform for that. And the second time at which it hosted a meeting, which could potentially have been significant, was it hosted all the Palestinian factions, including Fatah, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and the secular factions as well, for a national unity agreement. Again, it didn't have that much traction on the ground, but China is being used, I think, in that sense as a way of indicating it's used as a message board that to America to say, no, you're not the only ones now capable of hosting potentially significant diplomatic moves. China is there for us as well. And that Saudi Arabia chose that. And also that the Palestinian factions chose that, I think is a sign of, I would say, an increasing ability of a non-American actor, a non-Western actor to mediate. Because one of the things that's happened particularly in the Gaza war, but before that, is that America's lost its role as a mediator. It used to mediate between the two, and there used to be shuttle diplomacy. But America has been so adamant that it will continue to fund Israel that it has lost the power to mediate between the Palestinian factions. It's lost the trust. And so it is an opportunity for other nations to step in and say, right, we will be the honest broker. We will be the one who actually looks for peace and is capable of actually playing a real mediation role. And China has started, it's a long way to go, but it's started to perform that function. We've got into a frame of mind. Basically, what's happened in terms psychologically, in terms of the Western mind, is that the war has never stopped. First, it was a confrontation between the West and the Soviet Union, a global confrontation. Then it very quickly became a confrontation between the West and Islam, or Islamic fundamentalism, but Islam in general, another global power, nothing like the Soviet Union, but imagined. And now it's become a confrontation between the upholders of democracy, so-called, and authoritarianism, right? Which is classed as China, Russia, Iran, axis of resistance, axis of evil, as they put it. And all of these are powers threatening democracy. There is this thing that's going on in the West, which I think is very dangerous, which is that when we have an internal social problem, we blame the Russians or the Chinese for influencing social media, or for trying to change an election, or for some plot, technology transfer to China. But somehow there is this sort of feeling that the liberals are have circled the wagon train and are defending themselves against the Indians, and the rest of the world are the Indians, right? Of course, it's an incredibly primitive view, but it's very, very held. In reality, what's happening is that liberal democracy is being eaten away from within, and that the government's becoming less and less liberal and more authoritarian to hold things down. And that's exactly what happened in the riot, which is an internal cause. It's nothing to do with China or Russia or anything else. It's a completely internal reason. There were scenes of racial hatred not seen since the early 1980s. So I think these riots show how volatile and fragile democracy is in Britain, in Europe. Millions of voters have lost faith in their own governments, and millions of voters lost faith in the information they get from the mainstream media. Hence the power of social media to put lies out, basically complete misinformation. And the far right are strategically on the march and getting closer and closer to power each time. The more liberal democracy is threatened, the less liberal it becomes. And so the riots sort of were broken with instant and very, very heavy justice. Long prison sentences were given to people who had never fallen foul of the police, had no prison record, and who had never been in trouble with the police. And they're now facing, for social media posts, 3 years in prison. I think what you've got is a lethal combination between migration that was initially encouraged by the government. Even the last government, post-Brexit government, had more immigrants came in than ever before, legally, through student visas and all sorts of other things. So even that government that promised to reclaim control of the borders hasn't reclaimed control of our borders. So you've got a combination of migration and neoliberalism, and the two, i.e. cutbacks always to public services, not enough public housing, not enough council housing, not enough schools in the right area, a shortage of housing, a shortage of good jobs. There are jobs, but there are lots of bad jobs around, and people are having 2 jobs just to make ends, high cost of living, high taxation. You put all that together, and the lowest, and the people who are really angry, not people in London. London's booming because all the economy has gone down to the south. So there's an internal collapse happening. And that's why foreign policy is not subject to really a fundamental review, which it should be. And we've seen a retreat of the state over the past 30 years. So there is a profound crisis going on in what you call Western liberal democracy. And the right, the far right, which is neither particularly Western nor particularly liberal, is coming back up. So again, this may be too pessimistic, but the clearest analogy, historical analogy to where we are now is 1929, 1928, before a very big war, before a very big depression. That is where we think we are at the moment.
And this was another episode of China Now, a show that opens a window to the present and future of the Asian giant. Hope you enjoy it. See you next time.